Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC EduSet live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that we are carrying a series on Indian writing in English and under this series we have conducted numerous sessions. Dear friends, taking the series forward, today we would be talking on decline of the Mughals and rise of the English, and for this very discussion we have once again with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor from Department of English, University of Delhi, and we would like to tell you all that Professor Anand Prakash has delivered numerous lectures through this EduSet platform, and all the lectures are there for you on YouTube. Your continuous feedback regarding his lectures are very good, and we are thankful to you. So please keep writing to us and keep giving your feedback. So dear friends, let's carry today's lecture forward and let's welcome our guest, Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Prakash, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you, Geetika, and welcome viewers. Today's discussion is titled, as Geetika has already told you, Decline of the Mughals and Rise of the English. And this lecture is aimed at creating an awareness about the background against which English language and English writing in India started. It's a very difficult topic in the sense, that the points I'm making can't be easily located in dates and in incidents. But then there would be definitely certain incidents and certain dates which are, important to understand at least. I'll make a few points, and I can right in the beginning tell you what those points would be. I would talk about not merely the decline of Mughal India, but also its rise, because against that the decline is understandable, and then it starts declining. So that's the first point I'll make. The second point I'll share with you would be regarding the reasons for this over the long period of time. Mughal India comes into being as a historical epoch in the 16th century, and half of the 16th century, the complete 17th century, and also the 18th century. These centuries belong in Indian history to the Mughal period, to the Mughal India. So it would be nice to go into the details, some of the aspects of this period, because then one can understand how English finally appeared on the scene and started influencing life in the country in the 19th century onwards. So this will help us understand if we go over the 200 or 250 years of the Mughal period in India's history. The third point that I'll make would be concerning the abstract aspect of knowledge. History moves forward. History gets its dynamism just from the strength of knowledge. And there must have been a phenomenon of knowledge in Indian history in the Mughal period, because of which it emerged as an important force and formation. So I'll go into this, that the factors that made possible Mughal India as a phenomenon, very appealing and inspiring, were knowledge and production in tandem, and they offer the clue. So knowledge, gives rise to production, and vice versa. If there is production, then production, helps us, compels us to go into the area of knowledge, and both, strengthen each other. And the fourth point that I'll make in this respect would be that knowledge and production both come to a kind of virtual halt in the 18th century, and because of which, 18th century is the period of decline so far as Mughal India is concerned. So these are the 4 points I make, and I'll go into certain details and share with you my perceptions regarding this period, so that later we can take up this discussion further, where the decline of Mughal India actually creates conditions for the rise of the English. That will be discussed later. So let's first go over the period of the 16th and 17th centuries and its heritage in the Indian history. Mughals appeared on the scene in the 16th century. The period starts with Babur, then comes Humayun, and then we know the whole train, Akbar, and then Jahangir and Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. These are the lights of the Mughal period, and they were very successful rulers. but they had a heritage. In history, there are points, but there are also other things, Mughal India wouldn't have appeared on the scene from a blank. It appeared because before it also there were certain things. And what were those things? What were those happenings? That they have to be kept in mind. Not that I go into any detail regarding them, but then a kind of, I call it in fact Renaissance. It can be called Indian Renaissance. That had started occurring in the very beginning of the second millennium, 1000 AD onwards. India was not the same in this period as it was earlier. There was a kind of very mutual give and take between cultures, between civilizations, between intellectual backgrounds in this period. And at the level of polity, at the level of ruling, at the level of governance, there were clashes. At the level of economics and trade also, there would have been clashes. But then when clashes occur, then actual people come into a kind of contact. And this contact, gives rise to things, which are both positive and negative. And since these two cultures met, the Muslim culture and the Hindu culture and the Indian culture, in the period preceding Mughal India, so there was a very healthy give and take between the two cultures. For instance, Indians, would have their own way of life and they would share it at the level of the common masses with the people who came from outside. I'm not talking about kings and queens. I'm talking about the ordinary people, the soldiers from outside. They settled down here. They came into contact with the ordinary, Indian masses. And along with the soldiers, there might have been some technicians. There might have been some thinkers. Not immediately with the soldiers, but after the soldiers or even before the soldiers. Maybe the common people from outside also came and they mixed up with the Indians. And this created a kind of a culture. I do not call it hybrid culture. It's a very positive kind of a word that I'll be using. Even hybrid is these days a positive word. That when people give and take, then they inspire one another. And this inspiration is something unknown to Indian history. At that point of time, maybe in 2 or 3 centuries preceding it. But when this happened, this coming into contact of two cultures, when your view and my view and somebody else's view, they come together, they collide, they also learn to compromise with, they also be at peace with one another. That is the time which is most productive. And in Indian history, before the Mughals came, this kind of contact had happened. It happened at the level of ideas, it happened at the level of technology, it happened at the level of trade and commerce, all those things, and therefore new ideas emerged. It's not out of blank, that the poetry of Kabir, or Guru Nanak is written in the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries and the Bhakti poets. So the kind of openness, the kind of secularism, the kind of understanding of human nature that was articulated, the sense was articulated, that shows that there were something behind these developments, and Mughals inherited these developments. So when they start ruling the country from 1526 or so onwards, and when in the 17th century they prosper, and in fact they take the country forward. And administratively, politically, economically, India is at the top of the world, or at least among the top countries in the world. Economists and historians will bear me out when I say that Queen Elizabeth in England and Akbar in India, being contemporaries, they would be known to each other, and these two emperors at that point of time, these kings and the Queen in the case of England, there would be a kind of understanding between them at that point of time in terms of equality. So this is what India was under the Mughals. And how did it happen? I can tell you a few things regarding this. Knowledge, technology and awareness, these being the strong points of Mughal India. The question necessarily that is to be raised is, how did it happen? How did knowledge get a kind of boost that we see in the 16th and 17th centuries? And the answer would be that the bedrock of Mughal India was land related. India's land was very productive, but the proper study of it had not been made, proper measurements of it had not been made. The nature of soil, the nature of seeds, the requirements of crops, the regular appropriate kind of markets, the governance of the village, of the small town, of the big town, all this had to be properly imagined and worked for. And Akbar in particularly, with his knowledgeable people in the court, he would see to it that India is better known to its emperor, to its king, and the king helps the Indian producers such as the peasants and artisans in such a manner that India actually has a leap forward. So this thing happened in the time of Akbar, in the time of Jahangir, in the time of Shah Jahan, who is known as kind of a builder of India in the literal sense of the term. He raised lots of buildings. He raised, in fact, the whole habitation, the whole city, the city of Delhi as we know it, is built by Shah Jahan in the 17th century. So this kind of a prosperity, this kind of productivity, this came from the efforts that the kings raised through their policies, and these policies gave a fillip to every aspect of life. So we have to admit it, we have to locate it, recognize it, and then use it to understand the crux of Indian life and its prosperity in the Mughal period, because of which, as I said earlier, it gets well known to the whole world, and people vie with one another for trading with India, and not just English, but other people also come to India as traders, and they want to have those relations of parity, those relations of give and take, and commerce, that puts them together so that each benefits from one's own angle. So this is happening in the late 16th and early 17th century, and the whole of the 17th century, and the kings are in a way giving assistance and help to this productivity. So I'm saying this because this will help us explain why later on a kind of decline of the Mughals will happen. So this is the period of the rise of the Mughals, because of which there is that sense of equality, that sense of togetherness, and a kind of a culture is developing in India and elsewhere also, which is the culture of understanding, which is the culture of friendship, and this will make us understand how and why India under Mughals in the 18th century would decline. Well, from this land-related thing and its management and productivity that was given preference by the Mughals, came prosperity, money, growth, and development, and it can be seen all over the landscape of India's life. Then what was it that would later on create a kind of decline in India? I'm not a historian. I'm just a student of literature, and I have my own literary and other ways to approach the reality of the time. But then I can at least raise questions, and one question that I raise for my own benefit to understand how such a country as India under the Mughal rule will finally would meet decline. So decline will be happening also in the latter half of the 16th and 17th centuries. It would not be allowed to come up, but then the trend of decline is definitely rooted in, or should be rooted in, theoretically I can say, so that when there is a different kind of an atmosphere, then this decline will come up. So I'm saying this not as a historian, as I said, but then I'm saying it to find out as to what exactly happened that later on weakened India, took it towards what can be called disintegration of India. And one reason that appears to me in this particular phase is that the power at the top, the policy making procedures centered in families and individuals at the top. It is these that should be considered. These should be studied. For instance, in England, royalty comes to an end in the middle of the 17th century. and in India this didn't happen. India, this thing happens only when democracy sets in the 20th century. Before that, if India had to be ruled, it had to be a king, and the king came from a family, and the family had produced a king earlier, and then this king is replaced by his son. So this is a procedure. This also is the procedure all over the world, except England, where in the middle of the 17th century, the king is taken away from the seat of power, and power passes on from the king to the parliament. If this had happened in other countries, they also might have prospered. I don't want to go into the history of this as to how this would have happened, but definitely, if you give a chance to the people to have a consensus, to meet together, to take part in policy making, then the policy making becomes a collective venture, and as a collective venture, it is popular, and people put their heart and soul into the implementation of the policies. This happened in England. This might have happened in India also, but this didn't happen. Because of which, later on, when the certain other things happen, I'll go into them later. Then this very principle of getting the top authority from the family of the king, from being the son of the king, this particular thing might create hurdles in the process of what can be called development. And this would happen in India in the 18th century. But till the 17th century, other things being slightly better, the next king also would be taking guidance from the policies of the previous king, and the trend would continue. So I say that this was the fatal flaw of the Mughals. Like of all regimes, which were governed by the principle of kingship, and that because the kingship emanated from the families and dynasties. So Mughal India is Mughal India because every king came from the Mughal dynasty. So this is not exactly a plus point. It can be a plus point. People can argue, that the family tradition can bring in certain inspiring happenings in the family, in the policies, and those policies can be continued. This is of course true, but then there might be able minds outside the family. There might be aspirations that can be better articulated by people outside the families, and when that particular path of coming in of inspiring principles is blocked, then there can be a kind of decline. But what is the time in which this kind of a requirement becomes crucial? That's the question. But as I said, in the 16th and 17th centuries, Mughal India, because it is giving kind of help and assistance to knowledge, to the governance of the country, to the productivity of the land, and the trade, etc. They are helping trade in so many different ways through their policies. Therefore, economic prosperity occurs, and because of that, a relative stability is there in Mughal India. So this is the India of the 16th and 17th centuries. What happens in the 18th century? That India starts declining under the Mughal emperor, under the Mughal kings. This is the question that I'm raising, and I say that one thing is that there's nothing like taking help from, taking the opinion of, getting the consensus among, and disagreements if those disagreements are genuine from the masses. If that doesn't happen, then this very vital area of human productivity and human constructive thought that is in a way kept on the sides, because of which the country stops growing any further. So I say one thing, and in the 18th century, the contrast is complete between India, which is in the phase of decline, and England, with whom they will vie, with later in the same century, when the contrast happens quite clearly, and it's visible vis-a-vis England in the case of India. What is happening in England in the 18th century? Because these two countries will come into a kind of contact which is stronger in the 18th century, and if that happens, then we should also know about the other force which has already set foot in India in the 18th century, and it's going to crucially grab the centers of power in India. And I would say that in England, I'm a student of English literature and I know some little background about Indian literature. So I would say that in the 18th century, England is having that kind of Augustan age, the age of stability, the age of prosperity, the age of discipline, the age of going forward, of progress. And there's the idea of greatness, the idea of achieving triumph after triumph, victory after victory. That is what England is, which may not be the case in France, which may not be the case in other countries in Europe, and it's definitely not the case in India, but it's there in the case of England. So maybe a powerful English country and its presence at the level of trade and commerce in India in the 18th century would have created a kind of a fissure in the Indian mind regarding which country was superior when the two had that kind of occasion to exchange goods and other things. So this is the point I am raising. I will not give any specific answers to this, but I definitely say that when one country which is successful in its policies and the other country which doesn't know where to look for guidance because the family at that point of time does not produce as great kings as it did in the previous centuries. I'll go into it maybe a little later in the discussion, but at the moment I say that in the 18th century there is a give and take and an exchange between two countries, one of which is progressive and the other country which is at least in the state of stasis, if not actually declining. So that stasis might later on become so very severe, so very critical that a weak country fighting with or contending with a strong country will lose out, and that's what might happen. But this is one example. There might be other factors and points which have to be considered in the case of this. I call this crisis in India in the 18th century, and the crisis occurs because knowledge and technology, which were the bedrocks I said of Mughal India, they become weak in the 18th century. You read Indian literature in the 18th century. You talk to the creative minds. You talk to the thinkers, and you see that in the 18th century people don't have a sense of a future for which they can work. That they are all the time looking back to the period when things were stable. Aurangzeb, for instance, in the 18th century dies just in the first decade. After that, there are so many dissensions. I'll come into it later. But then, basically, the fundamentals of knowledge, the fundamentals of technology, the fundamentals of production, they have been given the go-by. They have been ignored. They have been sidestepped, and people are looking towards the conflicts of interests in different sections of society, and particularly in the political culture that is coming up at that point of time. So technology and knowledge and understanding and curiosity and all those things, they have come to a stop in the 18th century. And on the other side, as I said, so far as English are concerned, they have a better sense of knowledge, they have a better sense of technology, and the two are when they confront each other, then the benefit lies definitely with the foreign people who come here to trade. They know more, they understand more. They have had back home a kind of a spurt in intellectual and creative activity and energies, because of which when they come here, they are packed with a different kind of power which we don't have at that point of time. England is very stable as a country back home, and India is a very unstable country at that point of time, because one doesn't know what's going to happen in the next 5 years or 10 years, and so people are not at that point of time filled up with any kind of energy. So that is what India is then. One important factor that is happening in India in the 18th century is that the land productivity has initially remained still and then it has declined. And land is the major the area of productivity in India at that point of time. So if land is not giving enough crops, and if the productivity of land is not being properly managed by the state policy, and if the peasant, who is the main producer of the Indian subcontinent, if that peasant is not well looked after, by the regime, then obviously everything, the whole edifice, the whole building, the whole structure of the political states, that will definitely fall down, that will crumble. And when the structure falls down, then its different parts also collide with one another. So that I'm using the metaphor of the building, and that tells me, this structure can be sustained only when its the roots are strong, and the roots, that is the village productivity, that has suffered a kind of loss which cannot be made up easily. So this land related productivity and the condition of the peasant, the plight of the peasant, that is something that is to be worried about. And in India, this has happened at that point of time. I will then talk about the background in which this thing is happening in India in the 18th century. And the background is such that when India is becoming weak, then it is being taken advantage of by the presence of the English here. And these people who trade, now they know that they can increase their trade by arm twisting certain people, by arm twisting the emperor himself, by siding with some of the merchants who will find English to be better helpers and better and encouragers than the Indian ruler, and therefore economically also they will side with the English. This happens in the case of people connected with the fights in Buxar and Plassey in the eastern part of India. In these two battles, English forces succeeded, the forces of the company succeeded, and Indian forces failed. And historians tell us that part of this failure on the part of Indians occurred because the economic might of the Indian traders was with the British. Jagat Seths, for instance, I read from the history books, Jagat Seths in Bengal, they were supporting the British in these battles, particularly in the Battle of Plassey, because of which, in the second half of the 18th century, a very large part of Indian revenue goes into the hands of the East India Company, which is becoming stronger and stronger day by day. So I've already given a kind of background to you viewers. That background is that a productivity related development which happened in the 16th and 17th centuries finally came to a moment where it had lost grip over it, and that loss of productivity that weakened the entire Mughal regime, and at the same time gave opportunity to the other force, the other presence which was there at that time. And when the fight or the conflict between the two occurs, then of course the force which is stronger, the force which is better organized, the force which is a better fund of knowledge, that force succeeds. So I end here by saying that this decline is related with political instability, it is related with loss of productivity, and it is also there because there is less of political cohesion, social cohesion, less of harmony in the country in the 18th century. And this gives a kind of atmosphere of encouragement to the factors that would produce knowledge now, awareness now, thoughts and ideas through a different language than the language that Indians would have at that point of time. So here I come to the end, and then we can take up the other question of the knowledge and awareness through language further, as happens in the case of literature. Thank you. So, in this part of the discussion, we talk about certain aspects that relate to language and literature. I will not go into the political developments that have already been discussed, but then from there emanate factors that gel with language and literature. So, in the 18th century, what was the state of language and literature, and how would it relate to the powerful people in the country? So, this is our discussion starting with, and the points that I am going to make in this presentation would be the following. The first point would be that East India Company in the 18th century becomes an important factor in the economic arena, and it happens in 1765 when a treaty is passed between the British, between East India Company on one side and the Indian Emperor on the other. So, what happens is that after the Battle of Plassey and Buxar were lost, and the Britishers in India got a boost, economic and political boost, then this treaty was signed. And what was the treaty? This treaty actually would take the entire initiative from the Indian Emperor into the hands of the Britishers. And the treaty is that the Britishers from now onwards, from 1765 onwards, will collect the revenue of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha, which were the centers of production in the 18th century, and this revenue will be collected by them. So, the money is going into their hands, and that money they can use for their own promotion of interests. So, this is a treaty, and if the economic resources of the country are passed on to a company which is not Indian, which doesn't have roots in the Indian production, then obviously the country is going to suffer. So, virtually the control of the economy and with that of the polity passes from the Mughal emperor into the hands of the British in 1765 under a treaty, and the word used for this treaty was Diwani. So, Diwani was given to the Britishers to collect revenue. So, all the money that would come from the production, and it has to be collected by a British agency, and the British agency then can use it for its own promotion. Why did it happen? And that is the point that we can briefly consider here. That happened because after the death of Aurangzeb in the first decade of the 18th century, a kind of tussle began between the different princes, and one after another these princes would lose out, and then there would be further uncertainty and instability in the country. I can give you just one or two examples. One example is that when Aurangzeb dies in 1707, then his son Bahadur Shah, he becomes the ruler, and like most of these princes, most of the sons who had nothing to worry about because the father was successful, these sons would not learn the skills of governance in the 18th century, and as they did perhaps earlier, and therefore these are times of instability in the country, because the cohesion that the Mughals had achieved in the previous centuries, that cohesion is weakened and it will be lost very soon. So, Bahadur Shah would be there for some time, but he would soon die. I think he dies in 1712, 5 years after, and then there is once again uncertainty, because Bahadur Shah, when he ascended the throne, he was 65 years old, and when he dies, then once again there is a state of vacuum. So, the next prince who is in command, that person will come, but there will be other princes, and they will fight among themselves. And at this point of time, what also happens in the succession battle is that the sons are getting assistance from other important people. And the point that I made in the previous lecture, that this family tradition of passing on the scepter to the next one, this process is very problem ridden, in the sense that sometimes people can just conspire so that a person of your choice, a person of my choice, for instance, becomes the king, and when that person becomes the king, then the power is wielded by the group which supports. which may not have been the case earlier. Now, because there is already a tradition and there is no scope of exploration further, and the benefits of the father's achievements, they are being reaped on the easy go, by the sons. Therefore, the verve, the initiative that happened in the case of the early rulers of Mughal India, that verve has totally disappeared from the political arena. So in the 18th century, the tradition, the power, the inspiration, etc., easily passes on from the father to the son. And when that happens, then there are different groups, groupings, there are circles, there are centers of power, and these power centers, they start influencing the person who is to become the king later. So this process of fighting among the princes, this weakens the regime. I also say that when this process is weakened this way, then the lobbies that work behind the scene, the lobbies of the nobility, those lobbies also start fighting with one another. So it's not just that one prince is fighting against another, it's also that the lobbies in the nobilities, they also contend for power. So there is a twin kind of a tussle going on regularly in the 18th century Mughal India. And that thing is that nobody knows as to which policies will finally be accepted and implemented. And if they are in the middle of implementation, then of course maybe the prince is changed, the king is changed, the lobbies is changed, and another lobby comes to power. And when it starts implementing its policies, then other people are all the time creating hurdles for the implementation. So this process of disintegration, this process of conflict, this process of competition, which is unhealthy in nature because it takes away stability. So when this happens, then the country is bound to become weak, and that is what is happening immediately after Aurangzeb's death. I am not saying that Aurangzeb was all idealistic and powerful. Aurangzeb had his problems, which were not there in the earlier kings. And Aurangzeb was, playing politics in the 18th century and creating his own, centers of power to help him away from his kingdom. And he regularly wanted to increase the scope of his territory more and more without, bothering whether it can be really kept under control after some time. So certain things, that occur after Aurangzeb's, death would have taken root in his own time. He was not as acceptable to the Indian masses as the previous Mughal rulers. He was not as tolerant. He was not as open-minded. He was not as appealing and inspiring. He would deal with things with a stern hand, and sometimes the wrong kind of politics or the divisive kind of politics combined with the sternness of implementation, that thing can create complications. The complications particularly reflect themselves in the form of unpopularity. And Aurangzeb is not as popular as Shah Jahan would be, as Jahangir would be, as Akbar would be, and therefore this particular kind of unpopularity, this will percolate to the nobility, and from there on to the lower hierarchy, and finally the masses. So this is what is happening, and in this process, the regime is coming to some kind of a halt. There are no policies, and when the policies occur, then people die. Sometimes they are done to death. These killings, assassinations, the poisonings, in the palace schools, all these are happening more and more with a very sickening regularity in the 18th century India, and they give no scope for people to adhere to certain principles and norms, and people are always living in a state of uncertainty. I have been reading about 18th century in literature also, and one source of the 18th century life in literature is that famous poet called Mir Taqi Mir, and this person lived for a large number of decades. He was writing let's say in 1770, 1780, and he lived till 1830 into the 19th century. So, and when we read his writing, what do we see? It's not the writing of Kabir. It's not the writing of Guru Nanak. It's not the writing of other poets, Rahim, for instance. the writing, which has that sense of certainty. It's not there at all. This person is a very fine perceiver of the phenomena around him, and he is a witness to the 18th century life. And what he sees all around is something, that he can't relate to. So he becomes very, interestingly for us, he becomes interested in a kind of ishq, a kind of a love, which takes him closer to God. And people can ask, in literature, the question as to why somebody who is such a witness to, such a close witness to the developments in Delhi, Mir belonged to Delhi, how is it that he is taking more interest in things outside the world, beyond the world? Why is he talking about ishq only? And the sadness that is associated with and that accompanies ishq or love. Now this is the question, and one will find that he is a poet of sadness. He is a poet of melancholy. He is of course very tough in terms of perseverance, but then he is a poet of melancholy. And when there is melancholy in a poet like Mir, then one realizes that it's not his individual melancholy. It's not a melancholy. It's not a sadness. It's not that kind of absence of happiness which comes from inside oneself. It's a sadness which directly reflects the state of affairs of the society at large. And when Mir is writing like this, and he is not at all a friend to the events around him, then one realizes that perhaps there is something wrong, something rotten in the state of Denmark. In this case, in the state of India. That its poets, its finest poets, its most sincere voices are not able to celebrate anything that is happening in the time in which they live. So this is one example. There is the example of Sauda also, who is a writer of Marsiyas and who is definitely bewailing, who is all the time shedding tears and who is feeling very sad. So in the case of these poets, there is also the element of satire and bitterness and anguish. So the 18th century is marked by all these social emotions, the emotion of melancholy, sadness, bitterness, rejection, and taking one's mind away from the ordinary simple realities of life to things which can be understood also only at the level of the soul. Ghalib, for instance, in Mughal India, would be born in 1797. Just at the fag end of the 18th century, but then he carries in his bones, carries in his blood the memories of his father, of the family to which he belonged. And when he writes in the early part of the 19th century and the middle part of the 19th century, then one knows that a large idea of his a large part of his poetry actually takes influence from the 18th century that has gone by, in the physical sense. So the point I am making with respect to the 18th century is that it's not just its ordinary masses or the political actors, but also the poets, also the people of perception and sensibility. They also find India completely uninspiring in terms of its progress. There's no progress happening at that point of time, and this shows the crux of Indian life in the 18th century, and literature captures it. And these people are writing now. They are not using the accepted the Persian or Arabic kind of discipline. They are expressing themselves in the language that they speak in daily life, which is a plus point with them. But then their languages, the language that they use is quite effective in one sense, but it doesn't take them to the larger mass of people, to the larger mass of readers. So the way English would develop in a country's social life, that is not happening in the case of Indian languages in India in the 18th century. So you have these poets, and they will of course be popular in their own individual circles, but then their poetry will not take them to the heart of the masses in general, because they are not talking in that idiom. It's an expression of pain. You talk in a positive idiom only when you see some sign of hope in life. Then you share those things with the people who will read you. But if one is to share one's sense of anguish, one sense of pain, then that pain combines only a few people, and other people will lose interest in life as such and become cynical. So that's actually 18th century is the age of cynicism. It's the age of bitterness, and losing interest in life, in the secular aspects of life, and going into the soul, the spiritual aspects of life, there itself shows that the poets do not seem to belong to their time and to their age in the sense in which they would be productively involved if the country were progressing. So this is what is there in the case of in Indian literature at that time. The languages are of course now inspiring the people to speak in a language that will take them to the common experience, but then beyond that this doesn't happen. The poetry will be popular only in a circle, but outside that circle it will not appeal. So we have great poets in India at that point of time, but the greatness is not comparable to the wider appeal and acceptance of the poets in the preceding period. There is no Kabir in the 18th century. Kabir, who would be sung all over India, and who will talk to the not just the ordinary masses, but lower than that, and he would talk to the people who can't read and write, who can only hear, who can only understand, who can only sing, and he will galvanize them. He'll bring them together, and all of them will express their anger or their celebration, in a sense of freedom. That particular kind of poetry, the poetic expression, is not happening in India from the side of the Indians. So this is the point I want to make, because then I'll be able to tell you, viewers, as to how English will strike roots in India in the 18th century, because Indian languages are not effective enough to express, to articulate, and to give words to the developments that are around at that point of time. So when Indian languages are in a state of crisis, and another language is waiting to enter the scene in order to get busy with the interests of the people who would use it, that is the period what is called the 18th century. So the decline of the Mughal Empire, the decline of the Mughal in the 18th century is connected with the rise of the English in the 18th century, because there is a gap in the 18th century sensibility and life, and that gap can be filled up only with another stronger presence of people who will use a different kind of a language. Now see the irony in the case of the 18th century. When Mughal influence is declining, at that point of time there is no English worth the name in the Indian life. There are a few people who and they converse in English unto themselves, and they also move around and they take notes and sometimes write. But then when it comes to talking about the experience of the time in English, there of course there is no tradition in India of the what can be called Indian English. So Indian English will start from a zero in the 18th century, and on the other side there is a long tradition of literature in India in the Indian languages, and that is so weak, that is now waiting for the English to take over, the English language to take over. And this is the irony, this is the bitter irony that India went through in the 18th century, and this has to be noted, this has to be accepted, and then it has to be explained. This happens, the lack of interest in Indian languages with respect to the developments that happen in the country at that point of time, this is ascribed to, and I just make this point here, absence of scientific and technological development. There is no scientific development in India in the 18th century. So what would you use language for? There are no creative administrative policies in India at that point of time, because there is no stability. So how will the able minds in India articulate the ideas of development and constructive progress if there are no chances of that happening in life? So the language itself would finally dry up, and it will not have those creative resources which are there in a language if there are challenges from the state politics, the policies, the governance, and the principles of life. So that is not happening. On the other side is there is a language which is waiting to enter the scene, and it will start with zero, but then it will definitely prosper. So this is the time, the second half of the 18th century is facing this particular kind of a crisis, that there is a vacuum in the country with respect to articulation, with respect to using a language to understand, explore, think about. That is not there. So English has to fill up this vacuum, and English have this kind of a challenge then, and it's interesting to note how this challenge was met. And I would say that English was a very powerful language in the 18th century, in England also. Not as powerful perhaps in the 17th century and earlier, as it became powerful in England in the 18th century. And when that power gets transferred to the Indian conditions, when these practitioners of the English language move to India in good number, and when they face the challenge of articulating Indian reality in their own language, then this is that period when English will strike roots in India, and in the coming century, which is only a few decades ahead, they will be able to start English systematically, and that will pave the way for Indian writing in English in the early part of the 19th century. But then here is where India is creating conditions in which the language will be born. So Indian English is born in India in the latter half of the 18th century. So if there is no scientific and technological development in India at that time, and if that has to be brought in from outside in a language which is of the original country, then it is something that historians have to think about and see as to how Indian languages failed, and English was able to create a niche for itself at that point of time. I do not want to go into the political developments, but particularly in one case, I think a reference can be made to the invasions of Nadir Shah, and later on to Ahmad Shah Abdali, who regularly came to India and devastated it. And how were they able to devastate the country, the society, and particularly life in Delhi, which was the center of India at that point of time? Then of course, as historians would point out, I can only take some help from there. But then I would say that India was weak, and anybody who could collect a certain number of soldiers and a powerful military presence could come here, could devastate the country, could destroy the resources here, and could go away after looting it. So that kind of India was there in the 18th century. So the gap in the economy, the gap in the politics of the time, and the gap in culture, all these things create conditions in which a new a British presence and new English will finally come into, and then they will offer some kind of protection for their own interests. But then India at that moment of time requires this kind of a thing, and that's not happening from inside. So this is the bitter irony that I am talking about, and this happened in the second half of the 19th century. So I'll just take one more point and then come to the conclusion. This is the time when English people take it as a challenge that India has to be understood. Why? Because they have to collect revenue, because they have to move around from one place to another, because they have to now administer the economic activity in the major chunk of India. And for that purpose, they want to train their own people. And how do they train? They make a team of experts. These people will study India. These people will there's a great scholar called Sir William James, and he's a great Orientalist, a lover of India, a lover of the Orient, a lover of the East. And this person, with his intellectual capabilities, which are enormous, which are formidable, this person will study everything here, all the disciplines. I was just thinking of certain, areas that he had an expertise in, and I was just, noting down from the source, that this person first he gives a theory, and that theory shows, that the person has great commitment to the value of the idea that he is propounding. He said he made the assertion that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin have sprung from a common source. This might be true. This is historical linguistics, how languages develop in history. And he says that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, they come from the same source. And it's a kind of a kite flying, and this might be true to a certain extent. But somebody who is theorizing about this in the second half of the 18th century shows, that there is a different dimension to India, and that dimension is open not to the Indians but to the Orientalist called Sir William Jones. And on the other side, he's theoretically, going into this area. And the second thing is, he studies mythology in India. So that kind of a study has not been done in India until that time. So he systematically goes into the idea of Indian myths. He goes into literature. He goes into chronology. He's studying the dates. He's studying chess. There is a history of chess in India. It's a kind of a sport. It's also a kind of a mental game. Then there is botany. So he would go into the idea of botany, plants. He would go into music. And these are just a few, and there are many more that you would study. So Englishmen are now filled with a great passion to know about the diversity in India, and through their own language. So they will be Orientalists. Later on, of course, these Orientalists will be, questioned by English utilitarians in England, and there will be a clash there between the two. So maybe the Orientalists are finally, dethroned from the scene, taken away from the scene. But 1835 is not far away from the last decade of the 18th century, and in another 40 years there will be a reversal of this thing in the English attitude. First it is Orientalism, and then it is total negation of India. So in 1835, Macaulay would write a minute. It's a 10-15 page long document, and in that document he would basically assert that Indians do not have enough literature, they do not have a developed language, and what they require is the English language. The English language will help them understand the greatness of English literature, and that's how English will be brought in here systematically more and more. So you have the introduction. We have the introduction of English in India in the later half of the 18th century through Orientalism, through the love of India and the Orient. And in the next few decades, we will have a different kind of policy where Orientalism will be discarded, where India will be shown its place, so to say, that India knows nothing. And India is totally, outside the purview of intelligence and understanding. And Macaulay will very clearly and happily say that we have to teach these people not just language but also ideas and also literature. And in that minute he will say, we want to create a class of babus here who will think like us, who will have dark skin, but they will think like us, and they will be a kind of bulwark, against all that happens in terms of challenges. So, friends, in this particular discussion, I told you how English language sets its foot in India, and how it becomes, a medium of communication, a medium of study, a medium of exploration, and how this is going to emerge finally in the 19th century as the basis on which Indian writing in English can take shape, can develop, and can prosper. So with this, I finish. I've talked about the 18th century and its conflicts, decline, and the vacuum being filled up by Englishmen through another language, and then later on Indians also would start learning English, as Macaulay would suggested, and then they learn English, they will also write in English, and there can be a whole tradition of Indian writing in English that begins in the early part of the 19th century. So with this I come to the end. And
with this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. And dear friends, we would take your leave now, and we would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing on another topic under the series Indian Writings in English. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.